Hi, my name is Debbie Menzel, and I am presenting Chapter 8 in the Rubin textbook entitled Information Policy, Stakeholders, and Agendas. This is a very long chapter with a lot of information included, and I have tried to minimize the amount of information contained in each slide, and I reference page numbers in the textbook for long lists, so you can review the information if desired. Rubin defines information policy as any law, regulation, rule, or practice, written or unwritten, that affects the creation, acquisition, organization, dissemination, or evaluation of information. Information policy can be discussed from a number of perspectives and affects a number of stakeholders. The first stakeholder is business and industry. The business world has a conundrum when it comes to information. Capitalism promotes the idea that information is a form of private property. However, democratic society deems access to information a right. Businesses have two major concerns regarding information. The first of these is the desire to protect new knowledge. Businesses have a right to protect proprietary information and are able to do so through the acquisition of patents, copyrights, and trademarks. There are also laws that restrict an employee's use of protected information after they've left the company, no competition clauses within employee contracts, which prevent employees from working for competitors, and laws protecting computer code generated by a company. The second concern is the access to and organization of information, which involves the ability to access technical and scientific information easily and affordably, as well as how information is organized within the company for use. The second stakeholder is the government. The government collects, organizes, and controls a lot of information. It also controls how information is disseminated to the public. There are a number of laws that form the policies affecting this dissemination and control. Three of these laws are the Freedom of Information Act, the National Security Act, and the USA Patriot Act. The third stakeholders are information producers and disseminators. This includes the telecommunications industry, telephone, television, cable, and radio, DVD producers, publishers, computer manufacturers, including database producers and vendors, technology companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft, digerati, which consists of individuals who create and manage information technology, such as chief technology officers, software developers, and programmers, and finally, libraries, which are unique in the spectrum as they are the only stakeholder in this list that is not trying to make a profit. The final stakeholders are American citizens and the organizations that represent their interests. Citizens are major stakeholders in information policy, as the ability to access information affects their ability to make informed decisions. As citizens rarely have enough influence on their own to affect policy decisions, there are a number of organizations that represent the interests of the American people and work on their behalf to ensure information is available. These include the American Library Association, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. Information is moving from the idea of being something that should be freely available and important for improving understanding to something that can be bought, sold, or controlled. There are two factors which have contributed to this shift. First is the development of computers with the capacity to store and process large amounts of information, and second is a telecommunications infrastructure which allows computers to transmit large amounts of data anywhere in the world instantaneously. The information marketplace is a relatively new term that is used to describe this new scenario. There are those who are trying to restrict the availability of information in order to make a profit, which is of huge concern to LIS professionals. This idea of information as a commodity brings up the question, what are the information policy issues facing librarians and citizens? The first information policy issue of concern is protecting each citizen's right to privacy. In the 1965 landmark case of Griswold v. Connecticut, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected an individual's right to privacy. Although there is no express right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution, the decision cited penumbras, which is defined on thefreedictionary.com as, quote, the rights guaranteed by implication in a constitution or the implied powers of a rule, unquote. There's much legislation regarding information privacy, including the Right to Financial Privacy Act of 1978, which protects financial records, the Communications Privacy Act of 1986, which deals with cell phone privacy, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which deals in part with cell phone privacy and data communications, and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, which deal with the confidentiality of health and education records. Internet usage is also of great concern, as many individuals feel that their internet use is private. However, there are a number of things that can affect privacy, including cookies, spyware, and adware. Libraries take the need to protect patrons' privacy very seriously, and in 2002 adopted privacy, an interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. The second information policy issue is promoting access to and freedom of information. The United States has long held the idea that citizens have the right to access information about the government. There is a constant struggle to define the boundaries of privacy versus the public record. The Freedom of Information Act of 1966 applies to records held by executive branch agencies, and it provides guidelines for the release of information, defines reasons for withholding information, and authorizes judicial review. It ensures that all records that do not affect national security or personal privacy are available. Net neutrality is the idea that the Internet is open to all information and equipment without any possibility of discrimination by Internet service providers, or ISPs. In January of 2014, this idea was overturned in court, opening the pathway for ISPs to charge providers, such as Netflix, for the right to use their network. Only time will tell what the effect of this ruling will be. The ALA strongly supports net neutrality, and it has provided much information regarding this and the court ruling on their website. A link to the ALA website is provided on the references slide. In 2008, the Broadband Data Improvement Act was signed. This act involves the federal government in the development of national broadband access by providing seed money, promoting investment, promoting reform, and providing financial assistance to low-income families to encourage use of broadband services. The third information policy issue is the production and control of government information. Historically, government publication was performed by the Government Printing Office. The Federal Depository Library Program provided for the collection and organization of this printed material by decentralized libraries, or depositories. After 9/11, two issues emerged that affected the creation and dissemination of this government information: the privatization of government documents and the digitization of government information. In order to try and recover the costs of producing these documents, the government started moving that activity to the private sector and charging users to access the information. The ALA is concerned that the social benefits of information dissemination is not being considered, as there is the potential for only profitable information being printed, or that the cost of less popular information will be too high. Also, private publishers can copyright the material they print, and that information is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. The government is also uploading information directly to their websites without standardizing, indexing, or archiving that information. This provides less items for deposit, causing depository libraries to have to build their own document collections. More information about the FDLP can be found on the Department of the Interior's website, and I've posted a link to this site on the references slide. The E-Government Act of 2002 promoted the creation of Internet applications to provide access to and the delivery of government information and services. Libraries play a big role in assisting patrons with access to these services, primarily Medicare and unemployment, and there is some concern as library staff receive little to no training. The fourth information policy issue involves national security. Naturally, the government wants to restrict the dissemination of information which could threaten national security. This requires a balancing act between the need to restrict certain information and a citizen's right to access that information. Homeland Security deals with the critical infrastructure of the United States, which is defined as the physical and virtual systems and assets so vital that incapacitation would be debilitating. This includes information and telecommunications. The Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, or CIPB, was established to create a national strategy to secure the critical information infrastructure. They determined that we are currently vulnerable and recommended a plan, the main points of which can be found on page 324 in the textbook. During the early 2000s, the government recalled or removed information from public access that it deemed a security risk. The government sent memos to various agencies asking them to withhold potentially sensitive information, and in response, the ALA formed a task force on restrictions on access to government information, which issued recommendations on opposing any attempts to restrict access to government information. The Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act, better known as the Patriot Act, defined the crime domestic terrorism, and expanded the authority of domestic investigative agencies and broadened powers related to wiretaps, search warrants, and subpoenas. There's a potential impact on libraries as patrons might be subject to surveillance, librarians might feel that they should monitor patron activity, and libraries may be reluctant to collect data used for planning. Due in part to resolutions developed by the ALA, the Patriot Act was reauthorized in 2006 with strengthened civil liberties protections. The Library Awareness Program refers to an initiative that began in the 1960s, where the FBI recruited staff in libraries that were likely targets for Soviet spy activity. This program was discovered in 1987, and it led to an ALA investigation and congressional hearings. The program was discontinued, but there is nothing stopping it from starting again. The fifth information policy issue is the transmission and control of information across national boundaries. Globalization raises issues, especially concerning transporter data flow, or TDF. TDF concerns storage or processing of information on foreign computers. The impact of TDF can occur in four ways. The first impact relates to personally identifiable information, which is a concern as this information can be easily transmitted across borders. Second is an economic impact. Some countries have imposed tariffs and trade regulations that restrict or encourage the flow of information. There are also standards on the type of information, on the type of equipment that can be used, or the price. Third, there can be a national impact. Nations can borrow technology from other countries, sacrificing their own culture and putting themselves at risk for foreign intrusion. And finally, the last impact is sociocultural, as technology can transform values, assumptions, and traditional activities. The sixth policy issue is the attempt to control artistic and other individual expression. At various times in the history of the United States, the government has tried to control artistic expression, expression of opposition to the U.S. government, and sexually explicit material. Of great concern to LIS professionals is the attempt of the government to censor books, plays, and works of art. Examples include literary classics like James Joyce's Ulysses and J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. The U.S. government has also attempted to ban individuals and information from entering the country when it could be considered as against the U.S. government. Finally, federal law prohibits producing, importing, or mailing obscene materials. This is tricky as laws are typically interpreted based on community standards. A good real-world example of trying to enforce obscenity laws is the many court cases against Hustler magazine creator Larry Flynt, some of which he's won and some of which he's lost. Now that we've examined information policy issues, we need to review copyright legislation and issues. To do this, we must first look at copyright law and its characteristics. The Copyright Act of 1976 secures rights for authors and inventors to their creations for a set period of time. It covers literary works, musical works, and a host of other artistic endeavors which are listed on the slide. Copyright focuses on the idea as a fixed form, and ownership resides with the creator unless transferred to another individual or organization. It is important that the LIS professionals determine the line between the free flow of information and respect for intellectual property rights. Although there is no explicit language in the Act regarding electronic documents, it was revealed in a House report that computer databases and computer programs should be included as they represent an expression of an original idea. Works that were published before 1923 are considered public domain and are free for public use. Works created after January 1, 1978 are protected from the point of creation to the death of the creator plus 70 years, depending on whether or not the material was registered with the Copyright Office. The copyright owner has exclusive rights to the work which they created, including the right to reproduce the work, prepare derivative works, sell, rent, lease, lend, or transfer ownership of the work, and perform or display the work publicly. Libraries are able to loan a copy, make additional copies, or permit others to make copies of a work via the first sale doctrine and the fair use doctrine. First sale doctrine allows the purchaser of a work to sell or dispose of that work without the permission of the copyright owner. This also supports the idea of subsidized browsing, as libraries are able to purchase works using public monies and then loan those works out to members of the community. Fair use doctrine supports the idea that there are a variety of purposes for which reproduction of a work is considered fair. For example, criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Libraries rely on this doctrine to provide copies of information for patrons. This, however, does not apply to music, pictures, motion pictures, audiovisual works, or digital media. The National Commission on New Technology Uses of Copyrighted Works, or CONTU, has established guidelines for copying which apply to periodical articles published in the last 5 years and allow for up to 5 copies of an article in a calendar year. The Copyright Clearance Center, or CCC, was created to help pay royalties to publishers for copying that might exceed the fair use doctrine and to create agreements with journal publishers. In 1994, a committee called the Working Group on Intellectual Property Rights was created to examine fair use for digital information. They published the Green Paper, a report that led to the Conference on Fair Use, which established guidelines for educational multimedia, guidelines related to digital images, and aspects to distance learning. The guidelines were felt to be too restrictive, and it led 14 organizations, including the ALA, to develop a statement relating to protecting fair use. These can be found on page 337 of the textbook. The second copyright issue that needs to be addressed is file sharing. Current technology makes it very easy to share digital material without purchasing a copy, which is of great concern to industries that produce this type of media. Examples include MP3 files and videos. There's been a big push to try and educate the public about copyright infringement and software piracy. Digital rights management, or DRM, is the third copyright issue. DRM controls access to digital information unless specific permission has been granted or fees have been paid. It covers access, viewing, copying, editing, or transferring digital data and tries to restrict access to authorized users. It attempts to do this by creating a trusted system, which determines access in 2 ways. The first is via authentication, which involves making users log into a system to prove their right to access. The second method is authorization, and this determines the level of access. An example of this is our UWM email system. To log in, a user has to authenticate with the system to prove the right to access. Once allowed into the system, authorization determines what the user is allowed to access. For example, a system administrator would be able to see all the mailboxes, whereas a user would only be able to see their own. The need to capture usernames and passwords could potentially affect library patron privacy and confidentiality. An example of a trusted system is the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI. This identifier is assigned to objects in a digital environment. It never changes, and it is managed by the International DOI Foundation. This identifier has the potential to help in organizing data on the web. The Open Source Initiative is a movement where software products and their source code are made available at little or no cost, and users are encouraged to modify and improve it, and then share those improvements with the user community. Some examples include Linux, Perl, Apache, and Bind. There are a few open system library management software packages in development, including Evergreen, Koha, and Amilda. Creative Commons is a non-profit organization which provides copyright licenses at no cost. They provide 4 options to the creator. The first is attribution, which is where others can copy, distribute, display, and perform the work and derivative works if they give credit as required to the creator. The second is share alike, where others can distribute derivative works but only under the same license as the original and if credit is given to the creator. The third option is non-commercial, where others can copy, distribute, display, and perform the work and derivative works only for non-commercial purposes, and as long as credit is given to the creator. And finally, there is no derivative works, where others can copy, distribute, display, and perform the work, but no derivative works, and credit must be given to the creator. The organization is mostly focused on scientific information on the Internet. Licensing and leasing agreements regulate the distribution of information and is covered by state law, not copyright law. These agreements give no consideration to social issues, just economic benefit, and give libraries less control over information. In an attempt to manage the complex world of e-resources, many libraries are entering into shared e-resource understandings, or SERUs, which eliminate the need for a separate contract for each library. SERUs are based on trust and goodwill, but the library needs to keep in mind that sometimes licensing is still the best option. As there is little guidance in this area, 6 library associations have developed 15 principles to use when negotiating electronic resource use licenses. Some of these include the need for a clear understanding of the rights obtained, liability or lack thereof of unauthorized use, protection of a patron's privacy and confidentiality, rights to make archival copies, and protection of rights under copyright law. And these can be found on page 343 in the textbook. The increasing globalization of information has called attention to the issue of international copyright protection. The World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, is a United Nations agency which has adopted a copyright treaty for both print and electronic literary and artistic works. One of the primary features of the treaty is the extension of copyright protection to computer programs. This does not extend to web pages, however, as the work needs to be in a fixed form to be included. As these issues are extremely complicated, the Library Copyright Alliance, or LCA, was created to help decipher and enforce copyright protection. There are 3 recent copyright initiatives that are important to mention. First is the Uniform Computer Information Transaction Act, or UCITA. This act covers electronic products such as software, databases, and websites, and attempts to make commercial state contract laws more consistent. The act is controversial and has brought up some major concerns. Pages 344 and 345 in the textbook list these concerns in detail. The act was an attempt by software companies to gain legal support for their proprietary interests. Currently, only 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, have passed the measure. The second act is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which passed in 1998. This act is designed to make copyright protection more consistent around the world. It prevents unauthorized access to copyrighted works and prevents unauthorized copying. This has serious implications for librarians and favors the owners over the users. There are some issues that arise with this act, including the inability to disseminate information due to technological protections, like encryption keys, the possibility of lawsuits being filed if reverse engineering is performed, which could ultimately reduce innovation, and the reduction of research related to encryption technologies, which is also limiting innovation. The third legislative act is the Technology Education and Copyright Harmonization Act, or TEACH. This law, signed in 2002, expanded the rights of teachers to perform and display copyrighted works. However, it also prescribed greater control over this material in an online environment. The Association of College Research Libraries noted that the TEACH Act does not cover e-reserves and laid out 4 criteria in determining fair use for digital documents, which are the character of the use, the nature of the work, the amount used, and the effect of this use on the market, which is from page 348 in the textbook. There are 3 major pieces of legislation relating to the telecommunications industry which affect information policy. The first is the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which contains 2 provisions that affect libraries. The first is the Snow-Rockefeller-Exxon-Kerry provision, which reduced Internet access rates for libraries, schools, and healthcare providers. This reduction is commonly called the E-rate. It provides a 20 to 90% discount for telecommunication services, Internet access, Internet connections, and maintenance of Internet connections based on the rural or urban status and level of poverty in the community. It is important to note that these discounts apply only to service and not to equipment. The Communications Decency Act, or CDA, is the second provision, and it assigned fines and criminal penalties to individuals for knowingly transmitting or displaying indecent material to minors. Ultimately, this provision was declared unconstitutional as the definitions were too broad. The second piece of telecommunications legislation is the Child Online Protection Act. This act, passed in 1998, attempted to restrict viewing of adult material to adults only by requiring credit card certification or other codes. In 2009, this was also declared unconstitutional. The third piece of legislation is the Child's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. This act addresses access to offensive content on the Internet in schools and libraries, and through this legislation, the FCC has imposed rules which affect the ability to obtain the E-rate. Schools and libraries must have a safety policy and technical protection measures in place to block or filter access to Internet material that could be deemed harmful. They must also educate minors about appropriate online behavior and are required to adopt and enforce a policy to monitor a minor's online activity. The Neighborhood Children's Internet Protection Act is a complementary piece of legislation which was passed at the same time as CIPA. There are 5 additional components to this act which can be reviewed on page 350 of the textbook. CIPA has also been challenged in court as being unconstitutional. However, the Supreme Court upheld the law, stating that although there are filters on the Internet for minors' protection, these filters can be removed for adult access. There are some concerns about this for LIS professionals. These include the potential for overblocking, that people may be reluctant to ask for the filter to be removed, that the filters could block access to information to minors that is constitutionally protected, and that the ALA Bill of Rights states that age should not be considered when access to information is involved. The major pieces of legislation relating to education which affect information policy are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, or ESEA, Improving American Schools Act of 1994, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, or NCLB, and the Higher Education Act, or HEA, of 1965, 1992, 1998, and 2008. ESEA was created to supplement state and local funding to improve the quality of education in public and private schools. Title I supported programs for low-income children, and Title II provided funding to enhance school library collections. The ESEA was reauthorized in 1994 as the Improving America's Schools Act, and it focused on issues of equal access to quality education, particularly for children living in poverty, for parental participation in schooling, and for professional development programs for all school staff. No Child Left Behind redefined the role of the federal government in education and attempts to tie student results to school success. This legislation provides a big opportunity for school librarians to partner with teachers to meet the standards set forth in the Act. More details about the requirements of NCLB can be found on page 353 in the textbook. The last piece of legislation, the Higher Education Act, supports colleges and universities. The most current iteration of the law deals with improving teacher quality, promoting international education, improving financial aid and student assistance, and monitoring tuition and total costs. It also encourages the development of distance learning programs, which, as online students ourselves, we've all benefited from. There are a number of pieces of library legislation that affect information policy. Although not legislation, it is important to note that the Copyright Office is a part of the Library of Congress. It requires that 2 copies of each copyrighted item be deposited in the library, which contributes to the preservation of history and research materials. The library also created the Section 108 Study Group to explore the relationship of the Copyright Act to the preservation and scholarly use of digital material. A link to their website with more information on the group and its report is provided on the references slide. The Library Services Act originally provided funds for libraries serving less than 10,000 people. However, when the Act was revised in 1964, this restriction was removed. At that time, the name was changed to the Library Services and Construction Act, or LSCA. This act provided funding for the expansion of library services and library construction. The Museum and Library Service Act of 1996, or MLSA, established the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, and it repealed the LSCA. The Library Services and Technology Act, or LSTA, is related to the MLSA and provides support for library services and technology, with a special focus on literacy programs. It also authorized various grant programs. Both the MLSA and IMLS work to promote lifelong learning initiatives. The final act is the National Commission on Libraries and Information Science Act of 1970, PL 940345. This act created a nonpartisan independent agency called the United States National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, or NCLIS, and was created to continuously assess the problems and opportunities that face libraries. They have commissioned many studies and sponsored multiple conferences to examine issues facing libraries and the dissemination of information. Of key concern is national information policy, and in 1990 it released 8 principles of information relating to information policy. These principles can be found on page 361 of the textbook. Finally, there is one last piece of legislation to be discussed that affects information policy, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This act was intended to help boost the American economy in the face of a recession and benefited libraries in a few ways. It provided funding for broadband support, including grants to increase computer access in public and community college libraries, as well as broadband outreach for underserved communities. It provided funds for education, including public and school libraries. It provided funding for community service jobs, including public libraries. And finally, it provided funding for the development of community facilities, including public library facilities. In conclusion, we discussed four stakeholders: business and industry, the government, information producers and disseminators, and American citizens and the organizations which represent their interests, and how their interests relate to and are shaped by information policy issues, copyright legislation and issues, and telecommunications, education, library, and other legislation. Thank you.